Welcome back to Reproductive Physiology on Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. In the earlier part of this playlist, we talked extensively about male reproductive anatomy and physiology, and as you can probably tell here, we're going to be switching gears and talking about the female counterparts. And I think what you're going to find is that when we start discussing the anatomy, it's not going to be any more difficult than that of the male. In fact, we're going to just memorize a bunch of structures for the most part, and many of which are actually going to have homologous counterparts from the males, and we're actually going to make some of those correlations as we go. It's not until we get to the physiology component of those where it becomes increasingly difficult and complicated. For example, we're going to be looking at processes such as folliculogenesis and oogenesis, which are two very important coordinated processes, but there's a lot of stops, a lot of meiotic arrests, a lot of just nuances there that we don't see in spermatogenesis in males. In fact, spermatogenesis is pretty much a one-way, non-stop ticket to getting billions of sperm cells within a day. Okay, it's a very simple, straightforward process. The female physiology is much more complicated. And then, of course, in addition to that, we also have the menstrual cycle to worry about as well. That's not something we, of course, have in males. But first, we're going to start easy, and we're going to look at the anatomy. So, we're going to start by looking at a lateral view of this. Now, we're going to mainly look at the big picture structures. We're not going to worry about the ligaments in this picture. But there's one thing I want to actually point your attention to, and it's actually the relative orientation of the three major openings that females have down here. We're going to start with the posterior one. This is, of course, the anus. Now, this is not part of the reproductive system. This is actually the exit point, the most distal part of the digestive system. But notice that it is the most posterior. If we work our way anteriorly, we're going to run into the next opening, which is the vaginal orifice. Remember that orifice is just another term for an opening. So this would be the opening to the vagina. And then anterior to that would be the urethral orifice. Now, urethra, that ought to conjure up thoughts about the urinary system, and in fact, that's what it's a part of. So this structure right here that's kind of faded out a little bit because it's not what we're looking at, this is the urinary bladder where the urine is stored. And of course, the urinary bladder is going to merge into the urethra, and the urethra is going to exit at the point, the urethral orifice. Now, out of these three openings, the vaginal orifice and the urethral orifice are going to be contained in something called the vestibule. The vestibule we will see in the next slide, and understand that obviously this is a different vestibule than we saw in the special senses in the inner ear. So let's start filling in some structures. Okay? So we're going to begin here with the vaginal orifice. And actually, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. If we begin at the vaginal orifice and work our way up through this canal is referred to as the vagina. Okay? And you'll notice that in the vagina there appears to be a very muscular layer of cells here, and that's actually very important for the purpose of birthing the child, assuming that the woman becomes pregnant. Okay? But this canal right here is the vagina. Zoom in a little bit more. And actually look right here, this golf club looking structure right here, this thing is the uterus. Now, a couple of things about the uterus. First of all, this area where we have this interface between the vagina and the uterus, this area right here is called the cervix. In fact, this structure right here where this arrow is pointing to is the cervix. These little openings right here, they look like kind of horns. There's one right here, another right here. This is actually termed the fornix. It's not labeled here, but it'll be labeled on a future slide. We're actually going to look at some more specific features of the uterus in the next video, so make sure to look then. But there's a few things here that we can see coming off of the uterus. First of all is this tube right here, of which we'll also see some specifics in the next video. This is actually what's called the fallopian tube, or sometimes referred to as the uterine tube. So there's one on each side. Considering we're looking at the patient's right side, this is actually coming off of the left side of the uterus, so this would actually be the left uterine tube or left fallopian tube. And we can see it kind of loops around here, and then it appears to have these finger-like projections right here. These finger-like projections at the distal part of the fallopian tube are termed fimbriae, and they kind of intersect with this white structure that actually sort of looks like the giant egg, and this is actually the ovary. Okay, so the fimbriae are going to make contact with the ovary, and if we follow the fallopian tube back around, it's going to intersect back with the uterus. And again, there is a uterine tube and So again, there's a uterine tube or fallopian tube and ovary on each side, so they do have lefts and rights. Okay. One thing I want to make clear about the ovary, it is the female homologue of the testes. Okay, in males. So just like the testes are responsible for generating both hormones like testosterone and dihydrotestosterone and the male sex gametes, which are sperm cells, the ovary are responsible for the equivalent things in females. So the ovaries would generate hormones like estradiol and progesterone, and they're also responsible for oogenesis and folliculogenesis, which collectively generate the egg, which potentially could be fertilized. So the ovary is the female equivalent of the testes. Okay? Now what we can see here, and we'll look at this in more detail actually in the next video, but we notice there's actually several ligaments here, okay, that are actually connecting different parts of the female reproductive system to the abdominal walls. Okay? We can't see all of them here, but let me just make this point. Considering that the infant is going to be growing here in the uterus, assuming pregnancy takes place, we want this uterus to be anchored pretty tightly. So there's going to be multiple ligaments we're going to see, actually 5 in total. The first ligament I'm going to mention here is what's called the round ligament. And since we're looking at a lateral view, this side of the picture over here would be the anterior side. This would actually be the belly side. So the round ligament we can see is anchoring the uterus, the anterior surface of the uterus, to the anterior abdominal wall. Then if we look up top here, we have the suspensory ligament, and we of course can't see all of it here, but understand that this will actually anchor the fallopian tube to the lateral side of the abdominal wall. So remember that this is actually over here the left fallopian tube. So this suspensory ligament will anchor this fallopian tube to the left abdominal wall. And then if we look back here, we have the uterosacral ligament. This is going to actually anchor the posterior part of the uterus right here. You can't see all of this ligament, but it's essentially going to attach to the sacrum, which lies directly behind it. And we're going to see 2 other major ligaments actually in the next video. We'll come back to those. Now these structures right here in this box on the bottom right corner, we're going to actually take a look at these, a better view of these that is, on the next slide. But I want to mention that all of these things right here, all 6 of them if I'm counting correctly, are contained within something called the vulva. The vulva is just a region, and really what it is the female external genitalia. Okay, that's what the vulva is. So we have structures here, mons pubis. Urethra we've already talked about, of course, the urethra and the urethral orifice. That's the opening to the urinary tract from the bladder. Then we have the clitoris, the hymen, and we have the labium minus and labium majus. Now, labium minus and labium majus are the singular terms because we're going to have one on each side, left and right. So when we're referring to them collectively, we would actually say labia minora and labia majora. These are the singular terms right here. Okay, so let's actually look and see what we can see of these things. Okay, first of all, if we look anterior to the urethral orifice, we have this structure right here that kind of jets out externally. This is actually the clitoris. And the clitoris is the female equivalent of the glans penis in males. So the glans penis is pretty much the enlarged part at the very distal part of the penis that has a lot of nerve endings. And like the glans penis, the clitoris also has a lot of nerve endings. I don't have the factor by which it's more off the top of my head, but it suffices to say that the clitoris actually has more nerve endings than the glans penis in males. The clitoris is the female's most significant erogenous zone, which basically means that it has a huge number of nerve endings in it that function as pleasure receptors. Next, we have this structure called the hymen. The hymen is going to be a mucosal covering of the vaginal orifice. Okay? The hymen's function has been debated for a long time. Some people consider it to be a vestigial organ, meaning it does not have any known function today. It's lost its function over time. And then other people just have no idea what it is. In fact, there was actually a review that I saw at NCBI or PubMed that literally was just a review debating the function of the hymen, looking at all the theories about it. The most logical theory, I think, that I've read is really it's a covering to prevent pathogenic bacteria from getting into the vagina, okay? Because that could cause infection. Now, just like the GI tract has a microbiota, the vagina also has a microbiota, has bacteria that are naturally in there. And there ought to be a lot of commensal bacteria, which are good, and they keep the pathogenic bacteria down. Okay? And so the theorized function of the hymen is really just to prevent bacterial infiltration in there that could cause an infection. Okay. Now the labia minus and labia majus, we're going to save those for the next slide because we're going to be able to take a much better view at those. And then if we look anterior to the clitoris, we have this slight bulging structure right here, which is the mons pubis. Okay? Everything else we'll look in more detail on this slide right here. So we're going to be looking here at the external anatomy of the vagina. And really I could more or less just say this is the vulva. The vulva is really just the female external genitalia. And if we're really being specific of what the vulva contains, the vulva, which is really kind of outlined by this dotted line right here, this diamond, it contains the mons pubis, the labia majora, this should actually be labia minora, the clitoris, the vestibule, vaginal orifice, and the vestibular glands. We haven't mentioned the vestibular glands yet. But again, we can see a lot of this anatomy here better on this slide. So if we look anterior to the clitoris right here, we of course have the mons pubis, this slightly bulging region right here. And it's notable that on the mons pubis, this is actually where we see a significant amount of pubic hair growth. Remember that pubic hair growth in females is actually not caused by testosterone because females don't have a significant amount of that relative to males. But remember that females do have a significant amount of androstenedione, which is another androgen that's made both by the ovaries and by the adrenal glands. And so androstenedione is going to promote that growth of pubic hair on the mons pubis mostly. Okay, this structure right here, this is the part of the clitoris that protrudes outward. If we go back to the previous slide, notice that a portion of the clitoris, actually most of it, is contained internally, but of course there's this part here that jets out and allows physical contact. So this is the clitoris. We also see here a layer of skin that kind of lies over the clitoris. The prepuce is a layer of skin that provides protection. And actually the male equivalent of this prepuce is the foreskin. So just like the foreskin in males covers the glans penis, the prepuce in females covers the clitoris. Okay? Then we have the vestibule. The vestibule is this region sort of between the clitoris and the urethral orifice right here. Of course, this right here is the urethral orifice, the opening of the urinary tract. And if we go further backwards, we have the vaginal orifice right here. And if we go posterior to the urethral orifice, we have the vaginal orifice, which obviously is going to be responsible for coitus, or in layman's terms, sex. Now, prior to sexual intercourse, the vaginal orifice is going to be covered by that mucosal membrane, that thin membrane called the hymen. But normally, if that's present, whenever sexual intercourse occurs, that hymen is destroyed, it's torn, and it basically disintegrates. Okay? And the vaginal orifice, of course, is going to lead into the vaginal canal or the vagina. Now, if we look lateral to the vaginal orifice, we have these really tiny glands right here. Okay? These are actually the orifices of these glands. So this is the orifice of what's called the greater vestibular gland. If we go back to the previous slide, we actually see the greater vestibular gland right here. It's contained internally, posterior to the vagina, but it's going to have an orifice that's going to open up into the vulva, to the external part. And what the greater vestibular glands do is they're going to secrete a mucus that's going to lubricate the vagina during sexual arousal and subsequent sexual intercourse. And we're going to come back to that in a minute because that's not the only thing that does that. Then if we look between the vaginal orifice and the anus right here, all this area between that is referred to as the perineum. I really think the perineum ought to be pointed right here, although it really just contains this area in this region right here. Not that I want to use this in a scientific video like this, but if you're looking at slang terminology, the perineum is sometimes jokingly called the taint. Okay? So that's this area here between the vagina and the anus. Now, a couple other things. We also have the labia minora and the labia majora. Now, if we look at this part over here, there's actually a bulgy region right here that goes around the vagina on this side, another one on this side, so there's a left and a right. These ones that still have the same look as regular skin, these parts are the labia majora. And that's the thing about the labia majora. It's more external, and it is covered in the same material that your skin is made of course, is stratified squamous epithelium. And it has the same texture and consistency. Okay? If you go interior to that, this region right here, this is actually going to be the labia minora. This would actually be the right labia minora. Over here would be the left labia minora. And you can tell it has a different color, it has a different texture than the labia majora. Now the only other thing I was going to mention in this video, if we look at the greater vestibular glands, or at least we can see their orifices right here, I mentioned that they actually secrete a mucus to provide vaginal lubrication during sexual arousal. And that's true, they do have that function. However, this is actually a minor contribution to the lubrication that is known to occur during sexual arousal. Okay? Actually, the majority of that secretion actually is plasma from the blood. So how is it that the plasma, the fluid part of blood, is actually getting into this area, the vagina, to serve as lubrication during sexual intercourse? That doesn't make any sense to me. Well, remember that there's a lot of blood going into this area, just like there is in males. And a lot of blood going to this area may not be very intuitive to you, so we're going to use the male analogy. I think we all know that when males get aroused sexually, they get an erection. And what causes the erection? Well, it's redistribution of blood into the penis. And I mentioned in the previous videos, of course, that it's 90% going to the corpus cavernosum, about 10% is going to the corpus spongiosum, but the point is blood flow is going into there enough to cause an erection of the penis. So the same thing's happening here, except different structures, but there's still a lot of blood flow going into this area. Now, I want you to think back to your cardiovascular physiology, particularly in capillaries. What happens on the arterial end of capillaries when you have a high hydrostatic pressure? And I know this is bringing back some cardiovascular PTSD, right? So when you have the high hydrostatic pressure or blood pressure on the arterial end of the capillaries, you have filtration of fluid into the interstitial areas, right? That means that fluid is exiting the capillaries and going into the interstitial space, also called interstitium. Now in this case, it's the same kind of thing. All that blood flow that's going into this area, it's causing an increase in pressure on the arterial side of those capillaries. And so what's happening is the plasma, that is the fluid, is being filtered out of the capillaries. And it just so happens that that fluid, which is basically from the blood, is ending up in the vagina. And believe it or not, that's actually what contributes most to the lubrication of the vagina during sexual arousal and intercourse. I will mention that the greater vestibular glands do contribute. One of the things they secrete is a very oily substance called squalene. I actually have a separate video on squalene if you want to go learn about that a little bit more. But in any case, hopefully you've got a good understanding now of some of the reproductive anatomy of females. In the next video, we're going to continue by taking a different look at the uterus. We're going to see a lot more structures that we didn't see. We're going to look at the layers of the uterus and then also different segments of the uterus and the uterine tubes. We'll also see some other ligaments that anchor the uterus in place. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you very much.